Welcome to Muffin Talk. Kia ora and welcome to Muffin Talk. This program is brought to you by the initiative Titipounamu, Study and Joy. My guest today is Christopher Longhurst. Dr. Christopher Longhurst is a New Zealander from Ahuriri in Hawke's Bay and a lay Catholic theologian who spent many years abroad working in Rome, Italy and in North Africa. He is a fellow of the International Dialogue Centre KAISEED and co-leader of SNAP in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the survivors network of those abused by priests. Earlier this year, he became a companion of the King's Service Order for Services to Survivors of Abuse in Care. Welcome, Chris.
Kia ora, Beate.
A few weeks ago, Chris gave an online presentation for Titipounamu Study and Joy. His topic was Parrhēsia in the Gospels. The word Parrhēsia, Greek word, appears in the writings of the New Testament over 30 times, but it's yet not well known. Chris, how did you first become interested in Parrhēsia and what does it actually mean?
I actually discovered the word in looking for a justification for speaking truth to power in my own advocacy for survivors of abuse. And being a Catholic theologian, I looked at the example that Jesus gave in speaking truth to power as well, and talking back to the religious leaders of his own community, calling them out for their bad behavior, so to speak, because essentially that's what I was being accused of doing, calling out my leaders for their bad behavior. So I was looking for a justification for that based in the scriptures, and found the concept doesn't have its origins in the sacred scriptures and the texts, but because the early writers of the Gospels were writing in Greek, then they had used a term that had been popular in speaking in the ecclesia, the assembly, in Greek culture. 500 years earlier, its first recorded usage of the term Parrhēsia was by Euripides in the 5th century, before the Common Era. So that term was used by the writers of the Christian Gospels to describe their speaking truth to power in both a context of what is believed and also criticizing the behavior and the actions of the leaders of the community. So that's how I first came in contact with the term, and then was just interested in its history, interested in its etymology, and interested in its application today.
You say you were interested in the etymology. So where does that word come from? So it's Greek, of course, but is there another Greek word that is just truth, or is Parrhēsia also standing for truth? Are there two terms? Because in Greek you often have two terms for what there's one word in English, for example.
It is indeed a cognate, but it has nothing to do with truth etymologically. It comes from the two words in Greek, par meaning all and rhesia meaning speech. So it means saying everything. It's understood as a component of a free democratic society where you can say what you believe, you can speak freely. It's sometimes loosely referred to today as the freedom of speech, but it's much more than that, because it's not the right to say what you want. It's the duty to say what you should. Therefore, that's why it has to do with, it has an ethical dimension. It's not really freedom of speech, which is your freedom to say whatever you want. Parrhēsia is saying all, saying it frankly, saying it boldly, and saying it with confidence, it being the truth. And there's also that element of the inferior speaking to the superior. So there's risk involved in Parrhēsia. There's risk because you're basically whistleblowing or calling out. And there's a power imbalance too in the relationship between parrhēsiestes, the person using Parrhēsia, and the recipient of what's being said. So there's that risk of if the leader is not a good person, if they are corrupt, then they may punish or victimize the speaker too, which is the classic example, of course, again, is Jesus Christ, because not only was he threatened for what he was saying, he was put to death for that as well, as was indeed Socrates. Remember, Socrates drank the potion that killed him as a consequence of him being called out by the leaders of the Athenian courts for his standing on the streets of Athens, asking those tough questions and calling out the leaders of a so-called Athenian democratic state in his time. So they're the components that come together to create a definition for the context of Parrhēsia. So it's much more specific than just speaking truth to power or freedom of speech. One other point I'd just like to make, there is an element of Parrhēsia today that has to do with not just speaking to the person in authority. So if you look at experts today, scholars, critical analysis of culture like Naomi Chomsky, they claim that powerful people already know the truth and they're busy covering it up today. Therefore, it's not so much speaking only to them, but it's speaking publicly. It's speaking to them, but with other people hearing it too. So it's not private. It is public speech, but it's not just about speaking directly to authority. It's speaking to the ecclesia. And that becomes a different aspect of Parrhēsia in the Gospels, because remember, Jesus was speaking publicly. And those examples that you just used of over 30 times the term is used in sacred scripture. It's interesting because if you transliterate from the Greek into English, different words of English are used for that term. What I mean by that is that the term has context. So sometimes he's speaking boldly, sometimes he's speaking bravely, sometimes he's speaking publicly, but the one term that's constantly used by the author is Parrhēsia.
You mentioned the word should. A person, when he speaks truth, should know that there are boundaries. So you said when you speak truth, you have a moral component, an ethical component, and you should. So when it says should, it means that people who speak Parrhēsia, who speak boldly, have to have some kind of training before, or have to have some education, or is that if somebody speaks the truth boldly, does the person have to go through a certain education or acquire a certain skill?
That's an excellent question, because it speaks to the authority of the person speaking. Do they have the right to say what they're saying? On what grounds are they saying it? What's the basis of their claim that what they are saying is true? The Greeks, of course, have an answer for this. It's the opposite of the so-called tabula rasa philosophical idea of us being born with a blank slate and being influenced and being conditioned by our educational system and that. The Greeks have a word called synderesis, and synderesis is the belief that within the human person there is not just individual consciousness, but an intellectual and volitive way of knowing what is right and what is wrong. And the Greeks believe this is part of human nature, so that the human being knows good from bad. Therefore, the first principle of the synderesis, or the first principle of morality, is do good and avoid evil. So coupled with that principle, the speaking out is based on people know what is right and what is wrong. And I think this is a very fair principle, a very fair idea, synderesis, because universally, ethical systems, moral systems, and even religions coincide when it comes to good and bad behavior. For example, we know it's wrong to kill innocent life, to take innocent life. We just know it's wrong. Granted, there's context that can change the circumstances of the action. We know that saying things that are contrary to the truth are wrong. That's lying. Well, I'm not talking about people who say something that is just wrong, but people who are saying things that are like politicians or church leaders that are not telling the truth, meaning they're saying something that is actually contrary to what is on their mind, meaning they know the truth, but they're saying something opposite to it. That's deceit. So if we know that and we can prove that, then we would have, based on not just sacred scripture in the Christian tradition, but based on civilly protected rights, we have the authority to call that out. And that speech is civilly protected. And also, of course, we have an obligation to report certain things that would constitute crimes or lead to the harm of other people. We have the authority and the obligation to call that out too. So to answer your question, it's not so much about education, because one could argue even the marginalized person who is uneducated because they are poor could also be intelligent and honest. They simply don't have an education. And what's more, if you're educated in a certain system that conditions you or suppresses you, and let's be honest, I'm a Roman Catholic theologian, and the Catholic system does suppress certain people, women, for example, who are oppressed all women in the Catholic system who are oppressed. It doesn't mean that they are not intelligent or they're not educated. So on the contrary, it's not so much about education. It's about feeling your oppression, knowing the truth and speaking up about it. And anyone can do that who has an intellect and freedom.
I was just thinking of that story in one of the Gospels. I can't remember exactly the context, but it was about judging, because if you speak out and you say something about a person or about an action or so on, Jesus was asked what the procedure would be. And he said, first you speak to the person directly, you speak to the person again directly, and then you involve a witness. That's like a recipe from Jesus, which could be like, you should. So that would be one of the kind of rules that would be unspoken.
Well, indeed, but in that case, we're talking about fraternal correction, and you're talking to your peer. This is not parrhēsia. Fraternal correction is not parrhēsia. If you're my friend, you're my family member, or you're a member of my community, just out of common courtesy, I would go to you first if I had a problem with you. But remember, we're not talking about individuals here who are on the same level as us. We're talking about people in public positions of authority. Granted, you can privately speak to them in the first instance, but oftentimes, as is proven in the literature and in real life examples, that the person you're speaking to, because they are in a public role, they know what they're doing, they know the truth, and they're trying to suppress it. That's why it requires the bravery around speaking publicly. So indeed, the context is important, but parrhēsia is not fraternal admonition.
So thank you very much for explaining what parrhēsia is. And do you think that it needs to be advertised more, that people know what parrhēsia is, so that because if people know that it's already been used in the Greek ancient world, maybe we have to rediscover it.
Well, Pope Francis brought it back to life in some of his public apostolic letters and speeches and talks. He actually used the word parrhēsia, and he was speaking to his bishops, and he was speaking to the people too, inviting them to speak out bravely and boldly and with fear, the truth, of course. So indeed, I would advocate that this is a concept that needs to be taught in any educational curriculum in New Zealand, across the world, that has good citizenship. So I know it's quite popular today to have courses on good citizenship, therefore to teach students the right and responsibility to speak up. And interestingly enough, even in Roman law, remember canon law is a Christianization of Roman law. Canon law today and Roman law in its time protected those in the who were parrhēsias, again, speakers of the truth. It's kind of like the court jester concept as well, but that was a paid role. But the court jester had the right and duty to talk back to the king, for example, and to be a mirror to the king for the people. So, indeed, to just know these concepts. But when it comes to education, for our students to feel safe and confident, and of course, being the future of our world, them knowing about this, speaking truth to power publicly, would be a great ingress to their own civil service.
I think one of the biggest challenges to know what is truth. If everybody is genuinely truthful when speaking up, if you didn't have cases where truth was twisted.
That's an important point to make, and I think it just needs to be cleared for this interview that we're not talking about religious truth or scientific truth or mathematical truth. We're talking about honesty when it comes to human behavior. So it's not an epistemological term when it comes to parrhēsia. It's a moral term that I think would be better. Honesty would be better used. Good behavior. Remember, the problem with the concept of parrhēsia in the Gospels is that the Christians were using that as a pretext to evangelize and proselytize, meaning that they were speaking the truth of the gospel. We have have to be careful today because, that would interfere with other people's, other religions' right to speak their truth too. The important distinction between the idea of Parrhēsia and the Gospels and the pure concept of Parrhēsia in classical culture is that Socrates and Euripides and those using this term were emphasizing the moral import of truthfulness, not the doctrinal religious import of the concept. So I think we need to go back to the classical Greek idea of it, not the Christian idea of it today, because we're living in a multicultural, multi-religious world today, and it's not fair to claim that one religious truth is more true than another religious truth. And Christianity, Catholicism accepts that today, but it makes that important distinction. So, Christians are not all people are Christians, not all people are Muslims, not all people are atheists, but all people are human beings, and speaking the truth and being ethical is a prerequisite of our human nature, not of any religious orientation. So I think that's very important today. So just to clarify, we're not talking about religious truth, scientific truth, historical truth, which is more arbitrary. We're talking about right and wrong moral behavior, speech and conduct. What makes us morally good or morally bad today? That's what we're talking about.
Thank you so much for clarifying, and thank you very much for explaining a little bit more about Parrhēsia. And I guess now when we hear the word, we pay attention to it, and we'll get to the bottom, and maybe we will find a way to make it better known, especially with today's multimedia society, with all these different sources where people just speak their truth without thinking of maybe the consequences. What you said with a moral truth, I think that's really important.
It's a fundamental and universal moral truth: do good and avoid evil, and that's the first principle of morality, and that's the principle of the synderesis. That's why I think it's so powerful. And if you see the word written in different ways or pronounced differently, just remember that in English it's a transliteration from the Greek. So different pronunciations and different spellings are okay. One's not right or wrong; they're both acceptable.
Morally acceptable.
Etymologically acceptable.
Thank you so much, Chris. All the best.
Thank you, Beate. All the best to you too.
Out there, heroic peace is calling. In the bonds of love we meet. For the